And so they've studied this now in high performance sports within the domain of medicine, where it has to do with following different health protocols. They've studied it in schools. They've studied it in the home with parents and parenting. It's been so rigorously tested and vetted. It's remarkable. And there's just hundreds of full-on research projects where they've gone through and refined the whole thing. For most of human history, people have parented the way their parents and grandparents did, with culture providing the cues. We call this parenting 1.0.
For various reasons, parents began to question these approaches, and we started turning more and more to so-called experts to learn to parent. This was the beginning of parenting 2.0. This allowed for some real advances, but also a lot of confusion as we got further and further away from our natural parenting instincts.
Parenting 3.0 is about reclaiming those instincts and integrating them with our current understanding of child development. It brings together the wisdom of the past with the best scientific and psychological research of the present.
Parenting 3.0 isn't a fad or a quick fix. It's a set of principles that allows us to engage with our kids and life from an informed and empowered place.
I'm Jai Flicker.
And I'm Deb Blum.
Welcome to Parenting 3.0.
Welcome back, everybody. We're so glad you're with us today when we talk about something called self-determination theory. You might see it as SDT, and it's a theory that gets down to 3 primary needs that all of us have. And so, Jai, you want to get us started with it?
Sure.
Jai's going to be humble, but the truth is, Jai knows this in a depth that I think most people don't know. And it's exciting because, the way I look at it for you is that I feel like that when I first heard about self-determination theory and I went online and I looked it up on YouTube and I watched a couple of videos, it just seemed so simple to me. I was like, oh yeah, these are the 3 needs. Like, oh, of course, kind of.
Yeah.
And then as I have worked with you, whether it be in parent groups or just in discussions that we've had, I cannot believe how nuanced it is and how much there is to learn about it.
Yeah.
And how much the more that I learn about it, the better I get at sort of bringing it into my parenting and in my own personal experience. So
yeah, it is sort of deceptively simple, and that can be good and bad. I think it's good because it's sort of like very digestible. There are these 3 fundamental human needs, psychological needs, that they've identified over the past 40 years of research, and these 3 needs are really things that, when we get them met, we thrive, and when they go unmet, we languish. And so it's really helpful to know what they are so we can focus our energies in terms of our own lives and in terms of supporting our kids. And what those 3 needs are relatedness, autonomy, and competence. And we're going to explore what these are throughout this episode. We're going to understand how to look at them in our own lives and in our children's lives. And that's been so useful for me, and I hope it will be for you too. But before I dive into the definitions of each of these 3 core needs, I just want to talk a bit about why. Why is this useful and why is it important? And it turns out that the theory itself answers this question. And basically, it's helpful to know that self-determination theory it's a theory both of motivation and of well-being. And it turns out that those 2 things go hand in hand. So when we're more motivated, we feel better about ourselves, about life in general. And when we feel good, not just feel good, but when we have a high state of well-being, we're naturally more motivated. So those two things go together. There's a sense with motivation that is a subjective experience of vitality. And so, when it turns out that when we get our needs met, our vitality goes up, our sense of well-being goes up, and both our capacity for motivation and our actual amount of motivation goes up as well. So they're all tethered, and conversely, and this is what makes these three needs, is that if we don't get them met, it's sort of like going without certain vitamins or nutrients. It's not just that we, are better off when we have them, but, oh well, if we don't, our actual well-being goes down when these needs are not getting met. And what that actually looks like is increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of depression, and lower levels of self-esteem. So, and it kind of makes sense, because if you think about, on the one side, when they are getting met, if we're feeling motivated and full of vitality, and if you remove those things and take them into the negative, it's like we're feeling depressed and low energy and generally even apathetic on the far end of the spectrum. And if you think about the spectrum of well-being, when that gets reduced, we, instead of feeling safe and confident and positive, we're going to start to feel more worried, more pessimistic, more negative, and less safe. So that's where the anxiety part comes in. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these three needs, and then we can explore them a bit. I like to start with relatedness, because I am coming from this attachment background. And if you haven't listened to our 4-part series on attachment, I would invite you to do so. It kind of really helps explain the relatedness part of this self-determination theory. In fact, when in the literature, when they talk about relatedness, they reference attachment theory, because attachment theory is really the science of relating from birth on. But so because we have talked a lot about that in the past, about attachment theory, and because it's also probably the most intuitive, familiar idea that we need to feel connected to others, and we need to feel a sense of belonging. We need to have people that we care about and who we feel care about us. I don't feel as like I need to say as much about that. I definitely feel like I need to articulate autonomy, though, because autonomy is, we might have a sense of it, but it is probably the least intuitive of the three. And in what it really comes down to, what autonomy really is whether or not we feel we are in alignment with ourselves. Auto means self, of course. And so autonomy is, do we feel able to follow our own path in life? Are we able to make choices that we feel we're really behind? Or, on the other hand, are we feeling compelled by external forces or internal forces, for that matter, to make choices that we don't feel good about, that we're in conflict with ourselves about? When we make a choice, can we get behind it fully or not? So autonomy, the opposite of autonomy is feeling controlled, feeling coerced. The one caveat that in the literature the researchers always bring up. It's not a caveat. It's a distinction. Is that autonomy is not the same construct as independence, and this is super important because even within some of the sort of psychological literature out there, these two ideas are conflated. And the difference is that independence is about doing things alone. Just leave me alone. I want to be independent. Don't interfere with me. And the interference that the reason why they get conflated is that if somebody's interfering with you and you don't like it, one reaction is to say, back off, just leave me alone. And that would be independence. But autonomy does not require that separation. If it did, it would actually run counter to the first need for relatedness, right? So it would be like, I can be related, but as soon as I want to make my own decisions, I have to be separate and autonomous. But that's not the case. That's independence. You can be fully relating to others, and if those people that you're relating to are supporting your choices, supporting your autonomy, then you can make your own decisions while staying in relationship with them. And so this is a really important distinction, and we'll talk more about it later, but it's always important to make that distinction right away because those two ideas are so commonly confused. So that's autonomy. And the final fundamental human need is competence. And competence, again, is more intuitive, fortunately. And competence has to do with simply feeling good at what we're doing. When we're engaged in an activity, is it making sense to us? Are we experiencing success with it or not? And competence is our relationship to the world around us. Our autonomy is our relationship to ourself. Okay, this is one way that I kind of have made sense of these to make it even more intuitive, hopefully. Autonomy is our relationship to ourself. Relatedness is obviously our way of relating to others. And competence is about our relationship with the world around us. So we could think of that as self, other, and world. Autonomy, relatedness, and competence.
Now we just explained there are these three psychological needs, and in some ways just created a little bit of context for how they show up in life. But even more important to me, I think, was the validation of self-determination theory being so universal. And maybe would you mind just sharing like what you know about why this theory is valid? Just why it's so valid.
Yeah, sure. Well, so there's sort of two ways to get at this. It's, this is a theory that's been developed and refined over the past 40 years. So if you imagine, and there's really two researchers, Richard Ryan and Edward Deci, and they came up with this together. And if you imagine taking two very brilliant people working together for 4 decades on something, you're gonna figure out a lot, right? And they have, but then at least by the year 2000, about the halfway point, there were dozens and dozens of additional researchers who maybe were students of theirs or who were other researchers who found their work, who were validating and testing and expanding their theory in different settings. And the amazing thing is they really held a very high bar for what would qualify as a fundamental human psychological need. And they kind of compared it to biological needs. It's like there's lots of things that we would really enjoy and appreciate having, but there are some biological needs. Like we need to breathe, we need food, and we need to be sort of sheltered within a certain range of temperature. I mean, there's these needs that when we get them, it gives us the chance to thrive, and when we don't get them, it can lead to harm or death. So that's one thing. They also thought, if it's really a human need, it's not going to just apply to any one country or one type of person, or any one age group or any one gender. It's going to apply to everyone in all settings. And so they've studied this now in, high performance sports with pro athletes, and they've studied it in the domain of medicine, where it has to do with following different health protocols. They've studied it in schools. They've studied it in the home with parents and parenting. It's been so rigorously tested and vetted. It's remarkable. And there's just hundreds of full-on research projects where they've gone through and refined the whole thing. So that's one part of it. And then in my own life, it also had an intuitive resonance with me where I go, oh wow, this really makes a lot of sense. But then when I would go in and actually work with students or address my own child through this lens, I always have felt more effective. And I've seen better positive outcomes and felt more competent myself in working with and supporting others. So there.
Yeah. But it is important to know that, because I think one of the things that we're so committed to is not just presenting to people this, like some kind of idea or strategy, but something that really has been tested and vetted, and that really does cross over, that it would be really hard for anyone to come back and say, hey, it's just not relevant to me. I just don't need autonomy, like that we can feel confident that our children, all adults, all human beings have these 3 psychological needs. And it also keeps it more simple. Like, I think sometimes it's so easy to get into our heads about all the needs that everybody, kind of we think we have. And that they can, like, even need for, say, like affection and attention fall under relatedness,
right.
So it's just, sometimes it's hard to manage all of the things, I think, in parenting that we feel like we have to do. So the more we can just keep it more simplified, I think it helps.
Yeah. And any theoretical framework is really a map, right? It functions as a map, and the different maps have different zoom levels, right? And depending on what you're trying to do, zooming in or zooming out can be more relevant, right? And so the 3 buckets, the 3 fundamental psychological human needs, is a fairly high level of zoom. You're kind of zoomed out. It's not prescriptive. It's not giving you like some very specific parenting strategy. It's saying, hey, these are our fundamental human needs, and to me, just knowing that alone is super helpful. And then we can zoom into each of them and zoom in again and get more and more specific about where to turn left and where to turn right. But like for me, sometimes I'll just ask parents or students to rate their 3 needs on a scale of 1 to 10, just kind of a general, it doesn't have to be like, this is not it's more of a gist. It's a feeling. And it's like, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well is your need for relatedness being met right now? If you just think about all your relationships, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your peers, where would you rank that, right? So you could think, okay, well, and I've heard people say all kinds of things. Some people will be like, God, I'm really like a 9, maybe 10, 9, 9, 10. I've heard other people just be like, I'm probably more like a 5 right now, or a 4 or 5, Fortunately, I haven't ever heard anyone say I'm a 1 in the relatedness, but that could happen if you're just absolutely feeling totally isolated or feeling really kind of not connected. And then going to the next one and saying, well, what about autonomy? How controlled and coerced in my life do I feel? How much do I feel like I'm just being forced to do things? And how much do I feel like I get to I'm living a life that I feel like I'm not in conflict about, that I feel good about for myself. And so people think about it and they'll have a sense of it. And then of course the last one is competence, and I've heard some people be really high in the first two and then come to competence and then go, I'm like a 3 right now. I'm really struggling. And it's like, okay, well, that's obviously what the area of your life that's needing some attention right now. And just, I think identifying that doesn't immediately solve the problem, but I think it does help identify how to direct one's energy. Because if you're just feeling bad, sometimes we can just try to make ourselves feel better, and that might not actually address the root of the problem.
Yeah.
So I think looking at this this framework for our own selves is so helpful. Frankly, as I have once I identified, or once these 3 needs were pointed out for me, and I focused on really kind of attending to each of them, my overall sense of well-being has, just like the theory predicts, gone way up. Significant. Like my, and I was kind of skeptical at first. I'm like, how do you really measure well-being? And they kind of talk about it. It's like a subjective sense of vitality, a subjective sense of positive affect, and just like satisfaction. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it really has had that effect on me, and it's helpful. So I think starting with ourselves to kind of both increase our well-being, but also to learn about how these different needs operate is helpful. And then looking at how these needs are being met or going unmet in our kids is really helpful.
Really helpful.
Yeah.
I would say that's the same for me. That the more that I pay attention to these 3 needs, there's no question. I mean, I had been working on some of them without knowing I was working on them. Like autonomy had been something that I was really working on, and I didn't know that I was working on it, it wasn't this framework that I was using. But when I look back and I look at times when I didn't feel as autonomous, and now that I do feel more autonomous, that I feel like it's been such an important element to my well-being. But I also want to say that what I hear you saying, and I think is important, it's sort of implied, but it seems important. It's just that the 3 do work in concert. So it isn't really like, oh, well, if you're doing well in one and then not so great in the others, that they somehow make up for each other. They really don't. And that's important, I think. It's just important because it's so easy we're just so busy. And it's so easy to just be like, well, I'm doing really great in 2. Isn't that enough? And really, if you're really making a commitment to thriving, to your well-being, then it would be, no, actually, 2 isn't enough.
Yeah, if you're feeling like not really satisfied or happy, then then you have to attend all 3.
Yeah.
Their needs, their actual needs.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's great. So I think, is this a good time to wrap up, and then we'll I mean, there's so much more. It's hard to wrap up, but I think let's maybe leave it at this for now, and we'll come back next time and talk much more about motivation, and because it is related to this vitality. The vitality, it's like when our well-being goes up and our vitality goes up, we actually have more
energy to do things. And that's why that is really motivation. It's not just willing ourselves to do things,
right.
Which is so what I've come to, and maybe this is a good teaser, is like I think almost nobody actually has a clue or even a faint sense of how motivation actually works. I don't think most people have this slightest idea, and I kind of didn't either. The prevailing view of motivation is so off and so oversimplified and so wrong that it leads to all sorts of confusion and difficulty. And this is like by far the most comprehensive, most nuanced, most sophisticated, most helpful, most illuminating view or understanding or description of motivation and how it actually works that I have ever come across, and I cannot wait to share all about it.
That is quite an endorsement. Yeah, well, I hope, so this is my goal for you. I'm setting the bar really high.
Please.
Because my hope is by the end of that all of us will feel like we understand how to be motivated to go to the gym and motivated to eat healthy.
Oh boy.
Okay?
Oh
so that's
boy.
it.
That's
Your
so
bar is
specific.
very high. Okay, that's what I want. But I think that's great, and I'm with you. The more that I understand it, and I feel like I'm excited to learn more from you, because I've been deepening my learning of motivation. I am so impressed by how little I knew about motivation.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting.
That one is it's shocking.
Well, so part 2 is motivation.
Yes.
Next time.
Yep.
So today we're wrapping it up. So
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and please share and rate and review. We would just love to hear more specifics about what's working for you, what else you'd like to learn about, and always feel free to put in the reviews even, or email us some specific thing that you're going through, and we'd love to bring it into our episodes.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much.
See you next time.